They didn't see a warfighter. They saw tattoos. Too many of them. Too scattered. Too strange. Marks that crawled up both arms like vines with no pattern, no aesthetic intention, just chaos inked into skin that had seen too much sun and too many scars beneath. So they joked, whispered, circled her like sharks testing a ripple in the water, sensing weakness where there might be none. One of them asked, voice loud enough to cut through the morning chatter, "Why so many tattoos, sweetheart? You run out of skin or just running from something?" They didn't know what they were touching because those marks weren't decoration. They were a record. Blood and failure and survival carved into flesh when there was nothing else left to write on. And by the time they found out who she really was, what she had survived, what she had led, what those tattoos had mapped into her skin, like coordinates to hell and back, it was too late to take the words back. Now, before we show you the moment the entire room stood still and the truth behind the mark one Marine mocked as a kid's drawing, you need to understand something. Respect isn't earned by how loud you are. It's earned by what you carry that no one else can see. The training hall didn't look like much from the outside. Tan cinder block walls bleached pale by California sun. Fluorescent lights that hummed with that particular frequency that sets teeth on edge. An American flag pinned between two dusty whiteboards. The fabric faded just enough to show it had been there through multiple generations of recruits who thought they were tough until they learned what tough really meant. But inside, it was packed. 40 recruits sat shoulder to shoulder on aluminum benches that had gone warm under the weight of bodies carved from gym steel and caffeine addiction. Marines, Navy, Army Rangers, even a few Air Force combat controllers, all mid-20s, all top 5% of their respective training classes, all carrying that particular brand of arrogance that comes from being told you're exceptional. So many times you start believing it's a birthright instead of a privilege that needs to be earned daily. They were here for a Joint Forces Tactical Symposium, some inter-branch survival laboratory led by someone with operational experience, whatever that meant, in the endless parade of instructors who talked big and delivered small. The real instructor hadn't arrived yet, so the room had drifted into that relaxed banter that happens when wolves gather without a shepherd, side bets forming about who would top the physical assessments, low-grade posturing about deployment stories that might have been true or might have been bar talk polished to a shine. That's when Staff Sergeant Garrett Thorne noticed her. Everyone called him Rook. Not because he was inexperienced, though, as at 26 he was hardly a grizzled veteran, but because his last name was Thorne and someone back in basic had started calling him Rook, like the chess piece and in the military nicknames stick like napalm. He was Marine Raider's 6'2" of coiled muscle and Tennessee swagger third-generation Marine Corps with a grandfather who'd taken Iwo Jima and a father who'd rolled into Baghdad in 2003. He had a legacy to uphold, expectations to exceed, and the kind of confidence that walks the razor edge between leadership and arrogance. She was sitting dead center 2 rows up from the front. Small frame, compact shoulders, maybe 5'6" if she stretched, maybe 130 soaking wet. No rank insignia on her plain black PT shirt, no unit patch, no name tape. Nothing that screamed military except the way she laced her boots, methodical and efficient, every movement economized like she'd learned long ago that wasted motion could mean wasted life. Her head was tilted slightly down as she worked the laces tighter, pulling each crossover with the same measured pressure. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving, hadn't made eye contact with anyone, just found her spot and occupied it with the kind of stillness that might have meant shy or might have meant something else entirely. But it was the tattoos that caught attention. They crawled up both arms like some kind of aggressive ivy-thick line work in faded black ink that had seen too much sun. Jagged shapes that didn't quite resolve into recognizable imagery. Foreign symbols, or maybe just abstract marks. Constellations that didn't match any star chart. Primitive lines that looked almost burned into place rather than carefully needled. No artistic flourishes, no aesthetic intention. No color work or shading or any of the careful composition that marked professional ink. Just too many marks. Messy, aggressive, strange. One in particular stood out on her left forearm, visible as she bent forward over her boot. Crude black lines that zigzagged and curved with no apparent pattern, like a child had been given a crayon and told to draw a map with their eyes closed. Rook elbowed Corporal Wyatt Brenner sitting beside him and smirked. Looks like a sticker book exploded. Wyatt was Army Rangers Pennsylvania born, with the kind of methodical precision that made him excellent at following Rook's lead and terrible at questioning whether that lead was worth following. He glanced up, saw the woman, and his grin came easy. She lose a bet or something, because those are rough. Someone behind them, Specialist Nolan Cross from Air Force Combat Control, Montana bred, and young enough to still think cruelty was camaraderie, whispered just loud enough to carry walking graffiti wall. The laughter rippled through the benches like wind through dry grass. Heads turned, eyes locked on the small woman who kept working her bootlaces like she couldn't hear them, or had heard worse so many times it no longer registered as worth acknowledging. Rook couldn't help himself. He leaned forward across the bench line and tapped her lightly on the shoulder, two fingers casual, as asking for the time. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, voice pitched just loud enough to cut through the chatter and let everyone know something entertaining was about to happen. "Why so many tattoos? You run out of skin or just running from something?" A ripple of laughter spread through the benches, the kind that feeds on itself, growing louder as more people join in, sensing blood in the water. She paused, her hands stilled on the bootlaces. The room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. But she didn't turn fully around. Instead, she lifted her chin just slightly enough that her voice would carry without her having to raise it, and said, calm as glass on a windless day, "You don't know what you're looking at." Rook blinked. The response wasn't what he'd expected. Not defensive, not hurt, not the embarrassed stammering of someone caught out by their poor life choices. Just a statement of fact delivered with the emotional weight of someone reading a weather report. He recovered fast, grin widening, because retreating now would mean losing face, and losing face in a room full of alpha personalities was social death. "Oh, I know a bad tattoo job when I see one," he said, and this time the laughter was louder because he doubled down. And doubling down was what you did when you were confident in 26 and hadn't yet learned that confidence without wisdom is just noise. This time no one laughed. Not right away. Something about the way she turned to glance at him, just briefly, just enough to let him see her face in profile, seemed off. Not hostile, not insecure, not any of the reactions he'd been fishing for. Just still. The kind of stillness that combat veterans recognize in each other, but that young recruits mistake for weakness because they haven't yet learned the difference between frozen and ready. She rolled her sleeve a little farther down, covering a few of the boulder lines on her forearm, but not in shame. It felt more like someone sheathing a blade, putting away something sharp before someone got cut by accident. The room shifted slightly. Subtle. The air got tighter. The door still hadn't opened. No instructors yet. No authority in the room to pull back the leash. Just wolves in a cage sensing weakness, where there might be none, testing boundaries that maybe shouldn't be tested. Rook leaned back smug, thinking he had won some small victory in the endless game of pecking order. Wyatt beside him wasn't so sure. He'd seen something in her eyes during that brief glance. Something that made his gut tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the bad coffee they'd had with breakfast. She stayed seated, hands resting on her knees now. Eyes forward, and then the door opened. The door creaked open with the particular shriek of hinges that needed oil, and a sharp-clipped voice cut through the air like a knife through smoke. "On your feet." The chatter died instantly. Benches rattled as boots hit the floor in unison, 40 bodies snapping to attention with the kind of automatic response that gets drilled so deep it happens before conscious thought. A Marine gunnery sergeant stepped into the room with a clipboard in hand and the gait of someone who'd buried more men than these recruits had met. Silver hair cut to regulation perfection, face mapped with lines that told stories he'd never share. The kind of presence that makes an entire room sit straighter without anyone understanding why. He didn't bother introducing himself. "This is not a motivational seminar," he said flatly, voice carrying the gravel of 1,000 mornings screaming across parade grounds. "This is not a TED Talk. This is a practical assessment. You are not here to be impressed. You are here to learn, and if you're lucky, some of that learning will stick when the bullets start flying, and everything you thought you knew turns out to be bullshit, written by people who never left their desks." He paced in front of the benches, scanning faces like he was counting rifles before a breach cataloging who would fold and who might survive their first real engagement. "You'll do 3 drills," he continued. One physical, one cognitive, one tactical. You will do them fast, you will do them quiet. You will not ask questions unless you want me to give you answers that'll make you wish you'd kept your mouth shut. He turned his head and scanned the group again, eyes moving with predatory precision, then pointed without warning, finger stabbing toward the second row. You, step forward. The woman stood. No hesitation, no grunt of effort or theatrical display of readiness. Just a clean, smooth rise from the bench feet, finding the floor with the kind of balance that spoke to thousands of hours of muscle memory. She stepped forward with surgical efficiency, her boots barely making sound on the concrete floor. Rook smirked behind her, muttering to Wyatt just loud enough for the row around them to hear. Watch her fold. Wyatt didn't respond. He was watching her walk. There was something in the way she moved, not swagger, not the exaggerated confidence of someone trying to prove something, just economy, every step calculated, every movement purposeful. Like she'd learned long ago that wasted energy was enemy energy, and in the places she'd been enemies, didn't give second chances. The gunnery sergeant led her to the far corner where a 180-pound weighted dummy lay face down on a blue mat that had seen better decades. The dummy was dressed in full tactical kit, weighted to simulate a downed teammate with gear. Drag it to the wall, the gunny said, nodding to the loadout gear stacked beside the dummy. Full kit, standard harness protocol. She didn't blink. No swagger, no flex of muscle or cracking of knuckles or any of the pre-performance rituals that recruits use to psych themselves up. Just fast hands moving to the gear, straps, buckles, rigging. Her fingers worked with the kind of practice precision that comes from doing something so many times in so many high-stress situations that it becomes as automatic as breathing. Then she dropped into position, wrapped the harness around the dummy's torso, clipped the carabiners with sharp metallic clicks that echoed in the silent room and started to pull. There was no explosion of strength, no growling effort or theatrical grunting, no display of raw power for the audience, just pure mechanical movement, heel over heel, step after step, her weight staying low center of gravity anchored, using leverage and technique instead of just muscle. Her face was unreadable, not straining, not struggling, just focused on the task with the kind of intensity that doesn't need to announce itself. She reached the wall in 47 seconds, half the time it took the last recruit who demonstrated. No one clapped, no one made a sound. They were too busy recalculating, too busy trying to square what they'd just seen with what they thought they'd been looking at. A small woman in plain PT gear with messy tattoos who just made a physical task look effortless when most of them would have been red-faced and heaving by the halfway point. Reset, the gunny barked. She moved back to the starting position without visible fatigue, breathing steady, and the gunny handed her a headset and gestured to a digital panel mounted on the wall. Cognitive assessment, pattern recognition under duress. You'll have white noise piped directly into your ears at 110 decibels. Visual static on 30% of the screen. Rotating puzzle matrix. 90 seconds to complete. Timer starts when you put on the headset. She pulled the headset on. The room couldn't hear what she was hearing, but they could see her flinch slightly as the sound hit. White noise wasn't just annoying. At 110 decibels, it was physically painful, designed to simulate the sensory overload of combat, where explosions and gunfire and screaming all blend into a wall of sound that makes thinking feel impossible. The timer clicked on. Red numbers counting down from 90. The screen in front of her filled with an 8x8 matrix of symbols that started rotating, shifting position in a pattern that could have been random or could have been ordered depending on whether you could see through the chaos. Visual static flickered across 30% of the display, white and black pixels dancing to make everything harder to track. Most recruits who tried this drill in previous sessions had fumbled, flinched, lost track of the pattern, and started guessing. The few who'd passed had done it with seconds to spare, stumbling through on luck and determination. She didn't fumble. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on the screen, fingers tapping the response panel in steady rhythm, marking patterns with the kind of confidence that suggested she wasn't guessing. She was tracking, processing, filtering signal from noise with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to think clearly when thinking clearly meant survival. When the timer beeped at 90 seconds, the screen flashed green. Complete. Perfect score. The gunny looked at the readout, nodded once with no praise or acknowledgement beyond the bare fact of her success, and moved to the final station. Last one, he said, voice flat as Kansas highway. He tapped a tablet and a simulation appeared on the large monitor mounted above the tactical station. Drone footage from a mock village. Mud brick buildings, narrow alleys, 4 visible entry points marked with colored indicators. Standard compound layout that could have been Afghanistan or Iraq or any of a dozen places where American forces had fought in streets that all looked the same after a while. Identify the entry flaw, the gunny said. You've got 60 seconds. If this were real, your team is about to breach, and if you send them through the wrong door, they're coming home in bags. Clock starts now. She stood still for 5 seconds, just looking, not rushing, not panicking, just reading the terrain like it was a language she'd learned to speak fluently. Then she spoke. Northwest approach. Overgrown trail, but the grass is bent wrong. Tire compression pattern visible on the left side, irregular spacing between tracks. That's not patrol movement. That's a flank team staging for ambush. The main entry is a kill zone. Real target is the southeast compound through the market corridor where the sight lines break at the fountain. The room was silent. The gunny stared at her for a long moment, then looked down at his tablet, then back up at her. How did you? She cut him off, voice still calm, still even. I've seen this exact setup. Fallujah, 2006. Second battle, same compound layout, same flank position. They used the northwest trail to draw fire while the real assault came from market side. Lost 3 Marines to that trick before we adapted. The gunny's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe respect, maybe just the cold acknowledgement of someone who'd been there and knew she wasn't making it up. Correct, he said, just that one word. No fanfare, no praise. She returned to her seat without looking at anyone, boots clicking steady rhythm on the concrete, and settled back into her original spot like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just demonstrated physical capability, cognitive processing under extreme duress, and tactical analysis that suggested real-world experience in some of the worst fighting the American military had seen in the 21st century. Rook leaned toward Wyatt, whispering, voice tight with something that wasn't quite doubt but wasn't confidence anymore either. She thinks she's special forces or something. Without turning, without even acknowledging that she'd heard the woman spoke. I don't think anything. I know what I've done. The gunnery sergeant paused mid-note on his clipboard just for a moment, just long enough for the room to feel the weight of those words hanging in the air like smoke from a gun that's just been fired. Then he moved on, calling the next recruit forward, but the room didn't move on. They were still processing, still trying to figure out who exactly was sitting in row 2 with the messy tattoos and the quiet voice and the capability that didn't match what they thought they'd been looking at. Rook's jaw was tight. His hands were clenched on his knees. And somewhere in his chest, beneath the swagger and the confidence and the third-generation legacy, a small, cold seed of doubt was starting to take root. Breaks at training facilities are never truly breaks. They're observation windows. Moments where posture says more than protocol. Where the real hierarchy gets tested in how you rest, not how you stand. Where the guards come down just enough to show who's performing and who's just present. The recruits spilled into the side area just outside the main hall, a patch of gravel and bleachers shaded by a sagging awning that looked like it had been installed sometime around the Gulf War and forgotten about since. Canteens hissed open. Gloves came off. The laughter crept back into the group like a draft under a door, testing whether the tension from inside was real or just momentary discomfort. She sat alone. No one told her to. No one had declared her separate or other. She simply didn't join a circle, didn't hover for validation or lean into conversations that would have included her if she'd made the effort. She just knelt by her rucksack, rewrapping the gauze on her palms from the drag drill fingers, working with that same economy of motion she carried through every action. Her hands moved with practiced care, tight, careful. Like everything she did had been practiced enough that waste wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. The old gauze came off clean, no blood, just the compressed marks of hands that had gripped rope and steel enough times that the skin had adapted. New gauze went on in neat spirals, each wrap overlapping precisely. Rook clocked her from across the gravel patch. Still sore from being outperformed, still unable to square what he'd just seen with what his ego told him should be possible from someone who looked like that. Small, female, covered in ugly ink that marked her as someone who made bad decisions. His pride didn't retreat quietly. It never did. 3 generations of Marines don't teach you how to back down gracefully. They teach you how to hold ground, even when the ground isn't worth holding. He nudged Wyatt and Nolan, jerking his chin toward her. "Come on," he said, and it wasn't quite an order, but it wasn't quite a suggestion either. It was the voice of someone used to being followed. They approached casually, not aggressive, not hostile, just 3 guys walking over like they were waiting for a bus, not boxing someone in. The circle formed without obvious intention. Wyatt to her left, Nolan to her right. Rook settling onto the bench beside her, close enough that his proximity was a statement. "So," Rook said, tone light amused, the kind of voice you use when you're pretending something is friendly, even though everyone involved knows it isn't. "Those tattoos, what are they, bad decisions or bad breakups? Because I've seen some rough ink, but yours takes the prize." She didn't look up, just kept wrapping her hand fingers steady. "They're not your business." Wyatt leaned on the rail behind her, casual as Sunday morning. "Come on, every tattoo is a story, right? That's what they say. So, give us one. What's the deal with the art project on your arms?" Nolan smirked, young and dumb enough to think cruelty was the same as confidence. "Or she's just a poser. No unit tags, no branch markers, no deployment patches. Just squiggles. Maybe she's admin. Maybe she drew them herself in a mirror with a Sharpie." The laughter was thin, uncertain, like they were waiting for her to react and give them permission to go harder. She kept wrapping her hand. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough that the casual atmosphere started to feel forced. Long enough that Wyatt shifted his weight and Nolan's smirk faltered slightly. Rook nodded toward her forearm, toward the strange, jagged lines etched just below her elbow, the ones that looked like a child's drawing, crude and purposeless. "This one," he said, and reached out with 2 fingers like he was going to tap it. Trace the linings, make his point physical. Her hand moved faster than any of them expected. She didn't strike him, didn't threaten, didn't raise her voice or make a scene. She just closed her fingers around his wrist, firm and cold and utterly still, stopping his hand 3 inches from her skin. Not a show of force, not aggression, just a line drawn with no theatrics, no anger, no emotion at all, beyond the simple physical fact of prevention. "Don't touch me," she said. 3 words. Quiet. Even. The kind of tone you use to state facts that don't require debate. Rook froze. Her grip lasted only a second, maybe 2. Then she released him like nothing had happened, like she'd just moved an obstacle out of her way, and went back to wrapping her hand with the same methodical precision as before. The air shifted. Nolan laughed, nervous and high-pitched. "She's feisty." No one echoed it. There was no tension in her posture, no warning in her eyes, no threat implied or stated. And somehow that made it worse, made it heavier. Because violence that announces itself can be predicted, prepared for, responded to. But capability that just exists, that simply stops you without effort or emotion, that's something else entirely. Before it could go any further, before Rook could decide whether to escalate or retreat, the heavy interior door creaked open with the sound of metal on metal. "Back inside," barked the gunnery sergeant voice, carrying across the gravel like artillery fire. "Now!" The 3 men peeled away with forced nonchalance, Wyatt first, then Nolan bodies, moving with the casual gait of people pretending nothing just happened. Rook was last to turn, glancing once more at her as she rose and slung her pack over one shoulder in a single smooth motion. He thought he'd rattled her. He didn't see the stillness for what it was. Not fear, not submission, not any of the reactions he'd been trained to recognize as weakness. It was discipline, the kind that's learned, not taught, the kind that's forged in places where losing your temper means losing your life, the kind that waits for timing instead of reacting to provocation. And somewhere deep in Rook's chest, beneath the swagger and the pride and the certainty that he understood how the world worked, that small, cold seed of doubt pushed a little deeper. The recruits filed back into the hall with a little less swagger than before. Water bottles hissed open. Boots scuffed the floor with sounds that were just slightly more careful, more measured. Some muttered about the heat outside. Others just stared ahead, waiting but not her. She was already seated. Same spot, same posture, same unreadable face that gave away nothing of what she might be thinking or feeling or planning. Then the door opened again. This time it wasn't the gunnery sergeant. It was a man in service khakis, mid-50s, silver buzz cut, sharp enough to cut glass, strong jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than born. The kind of posture that makes an entire room sit straighter without anyone thinking about it consciously. Shoulders back, spine straight, every step deliberate and economical, the gait of someone who'd walked through fire and decided it wasn't hot enough to slow him down. He stepped into the room with an ease that didn't need to announce itself. Commander Nathan Graves. "Carry on," he said, waving off the automatic rise to attention before bodies even left the benches. The recruits stayed seated, but straighter now, more alert. Even Rook pressed his knees together, instinct overriding ego. Graves didn't speak right away. He scanned the room slowly, methodically, like he already knew the names and records of everyone in it and was just confirming what he'd read against what he was seeing. His eyes moved from row to row face, betraying nothing, and then they stopped. On her. A flicker barely visible passed over his expression. Not surprise, recognition. The kind of acknowledgement that passes between people who've shared something significant, something that can't be explained to outsiders because the words don't exist for what they've seen. He gave a short, respectful nod. She returned it with the same minimal movement. Rook noticed. The exchange lasted maybe 2 seconds, but he noticed, and his stomach tightened with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't comfort either. Graves turned back to address the class. "Today's session is not about tactics," he said, voice carrying the gravel of authority earned through action rather than rank. "It's not about drills. It's not about showing me how many pull-ups you can do or how fast you can run a mile while carrying weight. Those things matter, but they're not why you're here." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today's session is about what happens when every system fails. When your comms go down and your GPS is toast and your backup is 20 clicks out with no way to reach you, and the enemy knows exactly where you are because someone on your team made a mistake or got unlucky or both." Another pause, longer this time. "Today's session is about endurance, mentally, tactically, morally. It's about the moment when your body wants to quit and your mind is screaming at you to stop. And every logical calculation says you've already lost. And you have to decide whether to listen to that voice or tell it to shut up and keep moving." He glanced back toward her, then stepped aside, slightly opening the space between them and the class. "You'll be led by someone who didn't read about it in a manual," Graves said. "She wrote the manual, and then she burned it because the classified portions would get you all arrested just for knowing they existed." Silence. Absolute silence. He looked at her directly now, and when he spoke again, his voice carried weight that had nothing to do with volume. "Chief Petty Officer Alexis Brennan, retired, 17 years Naval Special Warfare." The air left the room, not dramatically, not with gasps or shocked exclamations. Just a collective held breath, 40 recruits simultaneously realizing they'd made a miscalculation so severe that the math didn't even begin to cover it. Graves continued, voice steady, reciting facts like he was reading from a service record that most of them would never have clearance to see in full. "Task Unit Echo, Joint Stag Elements, part of Task Force Blue's Forward Reconnaissance and Escape Cadre, decorated for valor during the Operation Crimson Dawn, 2008. She has instructed personnel from SEAL Team 2, SEAL Team 5, SEAL Team 8, British Special Boat Service, and Australian Special Air Service Regiment." He paused, letting each detail land like a round fired at close range. "She is one of 6 Tier 1 sea-level instructors in JSOC history, certified under live combat protocols, which means she didn't just train in simulations. She trained people while people were actively trying to kill them." Another pause. "0 team casualties under her command, 17 years. 0. Rook couldn't breathe. His eyes drifted down to her forearm, visible where her sleeve had ridden up slightly. To the mark he'd mocked. The kid's drawing. The ugly ink that looked like chaos scratched into skin by someone who didn't know what they were doing. He realized with sudden crushing clarity that he'd been looking at something he didn't understand. Not chaos, not carelessness, something else. Something that had meaning he couldn't decode because he'd never been where she'd been seen, what she'd seen done, what she'd done. "Oh God," he whispered, voice so quiet Wyatt beside him barely heard it. "What have I done?" Graves stepped back, yielding the floor. Chief Alexis Brennan stood, slow, steady, not dramatic, just present. She moved to the front of the room with that same economical gait, boots clicking, measured rhythm on concrete, and when she turned to face them, her expression hadn't changed. Still calm, still neutral, still giving away nothing. She looked out at the room at 40 faces that were looking back at her very differently than they had been 20 minutes ago, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, absolutely unshaken by anything that had happened or been said. "Let's begin." And Rook Thorne, sitting in the third row with his hands clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white, understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he'd just made a mistake that couldn't be unmade. The girl with too many tattoos. They'd seen the ink. They hadn't seen the steel underneath. Not until it was too late. Alexis Brennan didn't pace when she taught. She didn't point at screens or raise her voice or use any of the theatrical gestures that most instructors relied on to hold attention. She just stood at the center of the room with her arms folded loosely across her chest, letting silence do the heavy lifting that weaker teachers tried to accomplish with volume. And still everyone listened. Rook hadn't moved since Commander Graves had spoken her name, hadn't shifted position, hadn't unclenched his hands. He sat frozen in a particular kind of paralysis that comes from realizing you've been catastrophically wrong about something fundamental, and now you have to sit in that wrongness while the person you wronged stands 10 feet away with the power to make you feel every ounce of your mistake. There was no room left for sarcasm, no space for the easy confidence that had carried him through every challenge he'd faced in his 26 years. Only the growing heat of realization blooming up his neck like sunburn, spreading across his face in a flush he couldn't control, and didn't try to hide because hiding would require moving, and moving would require deciding what to do with his body, and he had no idea what to do with any of it. He stared at the floor, but he could still see it in his peripheral vision. That faded, jagged black mark on her forearm. The one he called a kid's drawing. The one he'd reached for like it was his right to touch something he didn't understand. Alexis walked slowly toward his row, not to challenge, not to confront, just to teach. Her boots made soft sounds on the concrete, measured and even, and when she stopped 3 feet from where he sat, she raised her arms, slightly revealing the tattoo in question. Blackened edges smeared by time and sun exposure. Curved lines like half a map scrolled by someone mid-stumble. Jagged corners that didn't quite connect. The kind of work that looked amateur because it was amateur done under conditions where professional wasn't an option, and amateur was the difference between life and death. "You called this one ugly," she said, voice low but carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the room. "You were right." Rook looked up. His throat was tight. His chest felt compressed like someone had strapped weight plates across his rib cage. She continued, still calm, still, even like she was explaining weather patterns instead of the story carved into her flesh. "It was drawn with charcoal, scratched in with a Ka-bar field knife on the third day of a hostage recovery operation in the Medellin region of Colombia. We'd landed under cover of a summer storm system. Drug cartel compound. DEA intelligence said 3 American hostages, but intelligence is only as good as the sources providing it, and sources in cartel territory have a life expectancy measured in days once they're compromised." She paused, looking at the tattoo like she was reading text only she could see. "Our comms were compromised within 2 hours. The cartel had frequency-hopping radio equipment, Chinese-made, sophisticated enough that they were cycling through our channels faster than we could adapt. GPS worked for the first 6 hours, then went dark. Solar flare activity or electronic warfare, we never confirmed which. After that, we had 3 things: our weapons, our training, and a hand-drawn map that a DEA informant had scratched onto the back of a cigarette carton pack." The room was absolutely still. Not even the sound of breathing seemed to intrude on her words. His name was Marcus Webb. Ex-Army, did 2 tours in Iraq before he got out and took contract work with DEA. He'd been living in Colombia for 8 years, knew the terrain better than most locals. When the cartels took the hostages, he volunteered to guide us in. Drew the map from memory because taking written documentation would have gotten his family killed if the cartel found it on him. She touched the tattoo lightly with 2 fingers of her opposite hand. He was shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. Not fear, not exactly, more like the weight of understanding what happens if you fail. The hostages were 2 DEA agents, male mid-30s, and 1 British aid worker, female 28, who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the cartel decided to make a statement about foreign interference. Alexis lowered her arms slightly, but kept it visible. We lost Marcus in the first hour. RPG strike to the ridge we were using for Overwatch. I watched him disappear in a cloud of dirt and fire and smoke. By the time we reached his position, there wasn't enough left to bring home. Just his boots and the dog tags he wore, even though he wasn't active military anymore. Her voice didn't waver, didn't crack. Just stated facts with the emotional detachment of someone who'd learned that breaking down doesn't bring anyone back and doesn't complete the mission. After that, I had 2 things. My M4A1 with 210 rounds and the memory of that cigarette carton map. I burned the original. His family was marked. If the cartel found that map on his body, traced the handwriting, connected it back to him, his wife and daughter would have been executed and dumped in pieces as a message. So I burned it, watched it turn to ash, made sure every fragment was destroyed. She tapped the ink again, firmer this time. But I remembered it. Every line, every fork in the trail, every blind corner where the terrain narrowed, every flooded canal where the storm runoff turned paths into rushing water. So I drew it again, on my arm, with charcoal from a burned-out processing shed in my KA bar. No artistic skill, no concern for aesthetics, just functional memory preservation carved into the only surface I knew I wouldn't lose. Wyatt, sitting beside Rook, had gone pale. His hands were gripping the edge of the bench hard enough that his knuckles had gone bloodless white. Alexis continued, and now there was something in her voice. Not emotion exactly, more like the weight of memory pressing through careful control. We moved in complete blackout. No night vision batteries were dead from the humidity and the constant rain. Just moonlight filtering through storm clouds and muscle memory of distances I'd marked in my mind. Mud up to our knees, wading through irrigation canals that ran through the coca plantations, water that smelled like pesticides and gasoline, and something worse underneath that might have been bodies decomposing in the runoff. She rolled her sleeve down slightly, covering part of the tattoo, but leaving enough visible to make her point. I counted paces, 1,847 steps to the first waypoint, 2,106 to the second. Used the tattoo to track our progress, comparing what I felt under my boots to what I'd memorized from Marcus's drawing. Every time we hit a junction, I'd check my arm, trace the monies, make sure we weren't circling back into a kill zone. Her eyes swept the room, making brief contact with faces that were locked on her, with the kind of attention that comes from realizing you're hearing something true and rare and impossible to find in any manual. The rescue took 11 hours. We found all 3 hostages in a concrete bunker underneath the main processing building. Zip-tied, blindfolded, 2 of them beaten badly enough that I wasn't sure they'd make the extraction walk. One of the DEA agents had been shot in the shoulder through and through, brachial artery nicked. He was losing blood conscious, but fading. She paused, and the silence in the room was so complete that the buzz of the fluorescent lights sounded loud as aircraft engines. I pulled them through a coca field under indirect fire, AK rounds snapping overhead like angry hornets. Cartel shooters on the ridgeline didn't have night vision either, so they were firing at sound and muzzle flash, spraying and praying. We moved low, crawled through mud that sucked at our boots and gear. I used the tattoo twice more to navigate around 2 ambush positions I remembered from the map, places where the trail narrowed and a smart enemy would stage. Alexis looked directly at Rook now. Her eyes were clear, steady, no anger, no judgment, just the weight of experience meeting the lightweight assumption of inexperience. Not one person on my 6-man team died that night. 0 casualties. We brought out all 3 hostages alive. The DEA agent with the shoulder wound made a full recovery, still works for the agency, sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of his kids. She let that settle for a 3 count, then added, voice dropping even quieter. You can keep your tribal bands and flag sleeves and your professionally designed ink that costs $500 and looks pretty on Instagram. Give me bad lines drawn by people who wanted to live. Give me ugly marks scratched into skin when there was nothing else left to write on, and failure meant bodies coming home in bags. The room didn't move, didn't breathe. Rook stared at her with eyes that were wet at the corners, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, and somewhere deep in his chest, something was breaking apart that he didn't have words for yet. Alexis turned, walked back to the front of the room, and folded her arms again. "That's one," she said quietly. "I have 22 more. And every single one of them kept someone alive who wouldn't have made it home without the memory those marks carry." The projector behind her flickered to life, casting pale blue light across the back wall, but nobody was looking at it. They were still watching her, still trying to process the gap between what they'd assumed and what was real. Still understanding that they'd been in the presence of something significant and had missed it completely until it was spelled out in terms too clear to misunderstand. And in the third row, Garrett Thorne sat with his hands shaking slightly and his throat tight, and the crushing weight of knowing he'd judged something sacred without having earned the right to judge anything at all. Alexis adjusted the projector angle slightly, her movement causing her collar to shift. For just a moment, the fabric pulled away from her left shoulder blade, revealing another cluster of marks. Muted brown-black ink, crude angular lines, nearly lost to age and sun damage. Symbols that might have been letters or coordinates or something else entirely faded enough that they looked more like scars than intentional ink. The room shifted again. That subtle collective intake of breath that happens when people realize there's more. Always more. Layers beneath layers beneath layers, and they'd only scratched the surface of something deep and dark and true. She caught the change in atmosphere, felt eyes tracking to the exposed skin at her shoulder, saw their attention lock on marks that were never meant to be public, never meant to be explained to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation through shared experience. She stopped adjusting the projector, turned slightly, touched the ink at her shoulder with her right hand, fingers finding the marks through the fabric of her shirt like she could read them by feel. "That one," she said without looking back at them, "was never meant to be seen." The words hung in the air like smoke. Heavy, significant. The kind of statement that draws a line between before and after, between the story you're willing to tell and the story you carry in silence, because telling it means reliving it, and reliving it means opening doors you've spent years learning to keep closed. She pulled her collar down slightly, exposing the full cluster of symbols. Brown-black lines arranged in a pattern that looked deliberate but not decorative. Functional. Purposeful. The kind of marks you make when beauty is irrelevant and memory is everything. Kurdistan, 2014. Operation Resolute Dawn. The room was absolutely silent. We were tasked with overwatch during an extraction of a Kurdish Peshmerga commander who'd been working with coalition forces. Intelligence said the pickup would be clean. Intelligence was wrong. Intelligence is wrong approximately 40% of the time in active combat zones, but nobody puts that statistic in the briefings because it would make the whole operation feel like gambling, which it is, but we pretend it's not because gambling implies luck. And luck implies lack of control, and lack of control is unacceptable in military planning. She touched each symbol as she spoke, tracing them with her fingertip like she was reading Braille. Our outpost forward operating base Phoenix took 4 120mm mortar rounds approximately 2 hours before the scheduled extraction. Russian-made, high explosive. They had our grid coordinates, which meant someone had talked, or someone had been compromised, or someone had made a mistake in operational security. Doesn't matter which, result was the same. Her hand stilled on one particular mark. Our Humvee took a direct hit, flipped into a dry creek bed 20 feet down. I was in the turret position, dislocated my left shoulder, crawling out through the hatch, while the vehicle was still rolling. Heard my shoulder socket pop like a gunshot. Felt the pain go white hot, and then cold, and then numb as the adrenaline kicked in and my body decided that pain was less important than survival. She turned to face them, now full attention on the class, and there was something in her eyes. Not emotion. Not quite. More like the shadow of memory, the echo of something experienced so intensely that it leaves a permanent mark deeper than ink. We fought for 19 hours. No air support sandstorm grounded all aircraft. No drone feed electromagnetic pulse from the mortars fried our electronics. No satellite communication. Just rooftops and shadows and the sound of gunfire echoing through streets that all looked the same after the first few hours. Concrete buildings, dust, blood. The specific smell of cordite mixed with sewage that you never forget once you have been in a city fight. Alexis paused, and in that pause, the weight of 19 hours compressed into silence. Comms were gone. The rest of my unit pulled back to Fallback Ridge, Charlie, 5 kilometers north, standard protocol for when a position becomes untenable. They called in our death notices, sent the reports up the chain, notified next of kin. My father got a visit from a casualty assistance officer who told him I was missing in action, presumed killed in combat. She touched the shoulder tattoo, again fingers moving across the symbols in sequence. But I wasn't dead, and neither was Petty Officer Second Class Elliot McKenna. We called him Red because of his hair, bright copper red, that stood out like a beacon, which is a terrible trait for a special operator. But he couldn't help genetics, and he was too good at his job for it to matter. Red took a round through his left femur. I heard the shot, heard him go down, heard him try not to scream, because screaming gives away your position, and position is everything in urban combat. Her voice stayed level, steady, like she was reading a weather report instead of describing watching a teammate get shot. The femoral artery was intact miraculously, but he was bleeding badly. I used his blood to mark fallback points on my uniform. 5 drops at each waypoint, crimson on tan fabric coordinates written in the only ink I had available. Dragged him through 300 meters of rubble and broken concrete while taking sporadic fire from positions I couldn't see clearly enough to return accurately. She traced one of the symbols on her shoulder, a triangle shape with harsh angular points. This one is a burned-out mosque. This line is a collapsed bridge over a dried canal. This circle is the exact position where I found Red after he'd been hit. GPS coordinates converted to symbolic representation because coordinates are meaningless without a device to read them, but symbols can be remembered, can be drawn, can be carried. Wyatt's breathing had gone shallow. Beside him, Rook had closed his eyes, but he was still listening, still hearing every word like each one was a hammer blow to the foundation of everything he'd assumed about the world. Halfway to the ridge, I stopped at what was left of a market stall. Found a broken piece of metal, maybe part of a vehicle frame, sharp enough. Used my KA bar to scrape the edge sharper. Then I carved these marks into my skin. Same pattern I'd been painting with Red's blood. Every waypoint, every turn, every landmark that would guide me if I lost consciousness or got disoriented, or if my memory failed under the stress and the pain and the exhaustion. She lowered her hand from her shoulder. I didn't mark these to honor anyone. I didn't mark them because I'm proud of what happened that night. I marked them so I would never forget where I lost control, where I held position, where I failed to predict enemy movement, where I had to drag a teammate through hell because I'd made tactical decisions that put him in the line of fire. The confession landed like an artillery shell in the middle of the room. Wyatt, the Army Ranger who'd laughed when Rook made his first comment, spoke for the first time, voice shaking slightly. You failed, but you got him out. You brought him home. Alexis turned to look at him directly. I failed to protect the timeline, failed to keep my unit together, failed to trust the intelligence that told us the position was compromised. I made decisions based on incomplete information and pride, and the assumption that I could adapt to any situation because I'd adapted to every situation before. And Red paid the price for my assumptions with a bullet through his leg and permanent nerve damage that left him with a limp he'll carry for the rest of his life. She paused, and the pause was heavy enough to feel physical. But you're right, I didn't fail to bring him home. Carried him 5 miles with a dislocated shoulder and no food and no water and no backup. He's alive, living in Virginia Beach with his wife and 2 kids, teaching shop class at a high school. I visit him every Veterans Day. We don't talk about Kurdistan. We talk about his students and his carpentry projects and how his daughter wants to be an engineer. We talk about everything except the night I dragged him through a war zone because I'd failed to prevent him from being in a war zone in the first place. The weight of that distinction settled over the room like fog. Commander Graves stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the back wall, silent until now, observing without interfering. His presence shifted the energy in the room, slightly gave permission for the story to continue expanding beyond what Alexis would tell on her own. She won't mention this, Graves said, voice carrying that particular gravel of authority that comes from decades of command. But Petty Officer McKenna nominated her for the Navy Cross, wrote a citation that detailed every action she took during those 19 hours. The courage under fire, the tactical adaptation, the refusal to abandon a teammate when abandonment would have been tactically sound and personally safer. He looked at Alexis, who didn't react, didn't acknowledge, just stood still, like a statue carved from something harder than stone. She declined the medal, sent a letter to the review board stating that she didn't deserve recognition for doing her job, and that accepting the medal would feel like profiting from Red's injury. The board awarded her the Bronze Star instead, which she accepted because refusing twice would have been insubordination. She keeps it in a drawer. Hasn't looked at it in years. Graves wasn't finished. He stepped forward again, and the weight in his voice grew heavier. You need to understand the full scope, he said. Kurdistan wasn't the only time she exceeded every reasonable expectation of human endurance. He paused, making sure every eye in the room was on him. July 2011, Mojave Desert. Chief Brennan and her team were tasked with protecting a Russian defector. High-value target with intelligence on al-Qaeda cells operating in Yemen. The defector was marked for assassination by multiple hostile actors, foreign and domestic. Graves walked slowly across the front of the room. 12 hours into the protection detail, they made contact with a hit squad. 8 operatives, former Spetsnaz, well-funded and well-armed. The firefight lasted 40 minutes. Chief Brennan's team managed to eliminate or disable all 8 hostiles, but during the engagement, she stepped into a gopher hole during evasion maneuvers. He let that sit for a moment. Fractured her left talus bone. That's the ankle for those of you who slept through anatomy. A fracture severe enough that most people can't walk, let alone run or fight. The medic on her team assessed her and recommended immediate medevac. She refused. Wyatt's eyes widened. Rook had stopped breathing. The reason she refused, Graves continued, was that the helicopter extraction would have given away their position. They were 72 hours from the planned extraction point, and she made the call that the defector's safety was worth more than her comfort. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the class. So she walked, 72 hours, no sleep, no real food, just MREs consumed on the move. Fractured ankle. And here's the part that makes it impossible. The daytime temperature in the Mojave that week averaged 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Someone in the back row whispered, "Jesus Christ." She fashioned a splint from paracord and a rifle cleaning rod, Graves said, navigated by stars at night, sun position during the day. Rationed water at 8 ounces every 6 hours, and she gave the defector priority on hydration because his intel was worth more than her life. Alexis stood still, face impassive, like he was describing someone else entirely. By hour 48, she was hallucinating, Graves said. By hour 60, she couldn't feel her hands. By hour 70, her team thought she might not make it. But she kept walking, kept moving, kept the defector alive. He turned to look at Alexis with something approaching reverence. She brought him in alive. The intelligence he provided led to the disruption of 3 major terror cells and saved an estimated 200 civilian lives across 4 countries. And when they finally got her to a medical facility, the doctors said another 6 hours and she would have suffered permanent kidney damage from dehydration. The room was silent. That's who's standing in front of you, Graves said quietly. Someone who walked 72 hours on a broken ankle through 115-degree heat because the mission mattered more than the pain. He stepped back, yielding the floor once more. And Alexis continued like he hadn't spoken, because to her it was just another operation, just another decision, just another time when the math demanded sacrifice, and she'd been the one holding the calculator. Tattoos aren't decoration, she said quietly. They're navigation. They're confession. They're the parts of the story you can't put in an after-action report because reports require clinical language and approved terminology, and these marks are written in blood and pain and failure and survival. They're the admission that you're not perfect, that you make mistakes, that people pay for your mistakes with their bodies and their futures. And if you're going to carry that weight, if you're going to continue doing this work, you need to write it somewhere permanent so you never forget what it costs. She turned back to the projector, adjusting it fully now, her collar falling back into place and hiding the Kurdistan marks from view. The screen behind her showed a new image, but still nobody was looking at it. They were looking at her back at the place where the ink was hidden again, at the small woman standing at the front of the room, who'd just torn open something private and raw and true for the purpose of teaching them a lesson they didn't know they needed to learn. In the third row, Garrett Thorne sat with his face in his hands, elbows on his knees, shoulders shaking slightly, with something that might have been crying or might have been the physical manifestation of shame so profound it had nowhere else to go. And Alexis Brennan, Chief Petty Officer, retired decorated veteran with 17 years and 0 casualties under her command, stood at the front of that room with her arms folded and her face calm and her voice steady, and taught them what it meant to carry weight that no one else could see. The barracks were quiet after midnight. Not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the heavy quiet of men lying awake in the dark staring at ceiling tiles that had absorbed decades of insomnia from recruits who'd learned something that changed the shape of their understanding. 40 bodies spread across rows of metal frame bunks, and maybe half of them were actually sleeping. The rest were processing, replaying, trying to reconcile the distance between who they thought they were and what they'd witnessed in that training hall. Garrett Thorne hadn't slept at all. He lay on his back with his hands folded across his chest, breathing steady and controlled, because if he let his breathing go ragged, it would wake Wyatt in the bunk beside him, and he didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain what was churning through his mind, like water through broken levees, flooding places that had been dry and certain for his entire adult life. The words kept circling, repeating, scratching at the inside of his skull like animals trying to get out. Sweetheart. Bad tattoo job. Running from something. Kids drawing. Every word he'd said felt like evidence now. Proof of something shameful he hadn't known was shameful until the context shifted and revealed what he'd actually been doing. Not joking, not bonding. Mocking someone who'd earned the right to be left alone through sacrifice he couldn't begin to comprehend. He replayed the moment he'd reached for her arm. Casual. Entitled. Like her body was public property available for his commentary. And the way she'd stopped him. Not with aggression or threat, just with the simple physical fact of prevention. Don't touch me. 3 words that meant something different now than they had in the moment. They meant you haven't earned the right. They meant you don't understand what you're looking at. They meant there are boundaries you're crossing without permission and without awareness of what those boundaries protect. And he'd crossed them anyway because he was 26 and strong and had never been told no in a way that made him understand that no meant. No, not, maybe not negotiate, just no. The sound of boots on concrete pulled him from the spiral of self-recrimination. Soft footsteps, measured. Someone moving through the barracks who didn't want to wake anyone, but wasn't trying to be completely silent either. Wyatt Brenner appeared at the foot of his bunk silhouette, visible against the dim emergency lighting from the exit signs. The ranger's face was in shadow, but his posture said everything. Shoulders tight, weight shifted forward slightly. The stance of someone carrying something heavy. You awake, Wyatt whispered. Yeah, me too. Can't shut it off. Rook sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bunk, bare feet finding cold concrete. The metal frame creaked slightly, but not enough to wake anyone who was actually sleeping. I looked her up, Wyatt said, voice barely above a whisper. On my phone, before lights out. There's not much, because most of it's classified, but there are stories. Reddit threads from guys who trained under her. A blog post from a British SBS operator who called her the most capable human he had ever met in combat. Reference in a book about Ramadi that doesn't use her name, but describes a female SEAL who held a building solo for 8 hours while her team evacuated wounded. Rook's throat was tight. How many enemy combatants? Estimated 40 plus. She was on a rooftop with a Scar H and 6 magazines. Didn't kill anyone. All suppressive fire. Kept them pinned and scared without crossing the line into lethal force unless absolutely necessary. When her team came back for her, she'd counted her rounds. Had exactly 11 left. Said she knew she had enough to get out if she needed to, so she stayed. The weight of that settled between them like a physical presence. We fucked up, Wyatt said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Yeah, Rook agreed. We did. You going to apologize? Yeah. You think she'll accept it? Rook thought about the way she'd grabbed his wrist, the absolute stillness of her face, the measured control of someone who'd learned long ago that emotional reactions were luxuries that could get people killed. No, he said, I don't think words are going to mean anything to her. A third voice came from the darkness near the door, soft and clear and unexpected. They won't. Most men turned. Petty Officer Kira Ashford stood in the doorway, arms folded, leaning against the frame like she'd been there for a while. The young Navy recruit from Maine who had sat in the corner during training and watched everything without speaking. Her face was hard to read in the dim light, but her voice carried certainty. She's testing you tomorrow, Kira said, stepping into the barracks proper. The final assessment. It's not just physical, it's about respect. Real respect. Not the kind you perform with apologies, the kind you demonstrate with action. Rook stood up, suddenly aware he was only wearing PT shorts, but Kira didn't seem to notice or care. How do you know, he asked. Because that's what operators do. They don't lecture. They don't accept hollow apologies. They test. They watch what you do when it matters, and they judge you based on that. Words are cheap. Anyone can say sorry, but can you actually internalize the lesson? Can you change? Can you demonstrate that you understand what you did wrong and why it was wrong? That's what she wants to see. Wyatt shifted his weight. You sound like you know her. I don't, but my uncle was Navy, SEAL Team 3. He talked about instructors like her. Said the best ones don't waste time on people who apologize. They waste time on people who learn. And the only way to prove you learned is to show it. The three of them stood in the darkness of the barracks, three people who'd been strangers 2 days ago and were now bound by shared understanding of a mistake that couldn't be unmade, only learned from. So what do we do? Rook asked. Kira looked at him directly, and even in the poor light he could see the intensity in her eyes. We pass her test. Whatever it is, however she designs it, we show her that we're worth the effort she's putting into teaching us. Because if we don't, we're just confirming what she already suspects, that we're loud and strong and absolutely useless when it actually matters. She turned and walked back toward her bunk without waiting for a response, and Rook stood there in the dark with the weight of tomorrow pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The training hall at 0600 felt different than it had the previous morning. Same fluorescent lights, same concrete floor, same American flag between the whiteboards. But the energy was different, subdued. 40 recruits filed in without the casual banter and posturing that had marked their first gathering. They found their seats quietly moved with more care, spoke in lower voices, if they spoke at all. Alexis Brennan was already there. She stood at the front of the room beside a table covered with equipment, rope, carabiners, a tactical litter, weight vests, headlamps. The tools of field rescue arranged with precise organization, each item positioned exactly where it needed to be for efficient access. Commander Graves entered behind the last recruits carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and found it grimly satisfying. Listen up, Graves said, voice carrying easily across the now silent room. Today's assessment is different from yesterday's drills. Yesterday was individual performance. Today is team dynamics under stress. You'll work in 4-person teams, mixed branches, randomized assignment. He tapped the tablet and names appeared on the screen mounted above the equipment table. Team Alpha Thorn Brenner Cross Ashford. Rook's stomach dropped like he'd missed a step in the dark. Wyatt beside him, Nolan Cross, the Air Force combat controller who'd called her a poser, and Kira Ashford, who'd understood something the rest of them had missed. This wasn't random. This was intentional. Alexis had designed this. Graves continued without acknowledging the tension that had suddenly filled the space. The scenario, 4-person team in hostile territory. Communications are down. You have 1 injured teammate. Extraction point is 5 kilometers north through mountainous terrain. Time limit 90 minutes. If this were real, your injured teammate bleeds out at 91 minutes. Miss the extraction window, enemy reinforcements arrive at 95 minutes. Fail either condition, everyone dies. He looked directly at Team Alpha. Your team leader will be chosen by Chief Brennan. Halfway through the exercise, you'll start leaderless. Figure it out. Like real combat when the lieutenant takes a round in the first 30 seconds and nobody's sure who's second in command and the enemy doesn't care about your organizational confusion. Rook's hands were clenched on his knees. This was it, the test Kira had predicted. Alexa stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but absolutely clear. "One more thing," she said, and her eyes found Rook in the third row. "Thorn, you're injured. Left ankle. Cannot bear full weight." She walked over and handed him an ankle brace, the kind used for severe sprains with rigid support bars on both sides. "Put it on, now." He took the brace with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't because he wouldn't let them. Strapped it on tight, felt the restriction immediately. The brace limited his ankle to maybe 30 degrees of motion, turned running into hobbling, made every step a negotiation with pain that would only get worse under stress. "Welcome to Kurdistan," Alexis said, voice still quiet, still even. "You're Red McKenna now, and your team has to decide what you're worth." The outdoor course was 3 miles of hills and obstacles that the California sun had baked into hardpan cruelty. Loose rocks that shifted under boots, creek crossings with fast-moving water, rope climbs, walls, terrain that was manageable at speed but became exponentially harder when you were dragging or carrying extra weight. Team Alpha stood at the start line. Wyatt naturally positioned himself at point, old habits from Ranger training taking over. Nolan checked his gear with nervous efficiency. Kira stood slightly apart, watching, evaluating, already thinking 3 steps ahead. And Rook stood on one leg, the braced ankle already aching just from standing still, and understood with perfect clarity what Alexis had done. She'd made him the burden, the weight, the decision point that would test whether they'd learned anything or would just repeat the same mistakes under pressure. "Go," Graves said, and clicked the timer. Wyatt took off at a fast jog, Nolan behind him, and for the first 10 steps, they seemed to forget that Rook couldn't keep pace. Then they heard him struggling, behind them breath already coming hard from the effort of hopping and hobbling, and they slowed. Not much, not enough. Just enough to not completely abandon him in the first 100 meters. "I'm fine," Rook gasped, pride kicking in like it always did, like it had been trained into him from childhood. "Keep moving, I'll catch up." "You sure?" Wyatt called back without stopping. "Yeah, go." They went, and Rook fell behind, 30 meters, 50, the gap widening with every step they took and every painful hop he managed. His ankle screamed. His breathing went ragged. The weight vest felt like it had doubled in mass, and they were only 5 minutes into a 90-minute exercise. Kira stayed back, not with him exactly, but close enough that she could see him clearly. She jogged at a pace that kept her in sight of both Rook struggling behind, and Wyatt and Nolan pulling ahead, positioning herself between the fragments of a team that was already fracturing. 15 minutes in, they hit the first obstacle. A creek crossing water, moving fast enough to be dangerous rocks, slick with algae. Wyatt and Nolan crossed without issue, hopping from rock to rock with the confidence of youth and capability. Rook reached the edge and stared at the water like it was an ocean. "I need the rope," he called out. "We don't have time," Wyatt shouted back. "Wade through. Use the current to help you balance." Rook stepped into the water. The current hit him immediately, stronger than it looked, and with only one good ankle, his balance was compromised before he even got halfway across. His boots slipped on algae-slick stone. He went down hard, full immersion, gasoline taste of creek water in his mouth and came up gasping. Nolan had to jump back in to pull him out. "Jesus, man," Nolan muttered, and there was frustration in his voice. Not cruelty, just the hard edge of someone who could see the math and didn't like the answer. 30 minutes in, Wyatt called a halt on a ridgeline where they could see the next 2 kilometers of terrain stretching out toward the extraction point, visible as a flag on a distant hill. "We're not going to make it," he said, breathing hard. "Not with Thorn at this pace." "I can push harder," Rook said, but his voice was hollow because they all knew it was a lie. He was already pushing as hard as he could. The ankle was the limiting factor, and no amount of will could change physics. "We need to leave him," Nolan said, and he didn't say it cruelly. He said it like he was solving a math problem. "Set up a comms relay point. Send recovery after we complete extraction." Rook felt something crack in his chest, not surprise. He'd known this was coming, known that his injury made him a liability, known that in real combat the math sometimes demanded sacrifices. "Do it," he said, voice rough. "Mission first." Wyatt looked at him, looked at the extraction point, looked at his watch showing 45 minutes elapsed, looked back at Rook, and Kira stepped forward. No, she said. Everyone turned. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, just absolutely certain in the way that makes people listen even when they don't want to. Chief Brennan didn't leave Red McKenna. She carried him 5 miles with a dislocated shoulder. We're not leaving Thorn. We don't have time to carry him, Wyatt said, frustration bleeding into his voice. The math doesn't work. Then we change the math, Kira said. We build a drag rig, rope, and carabiners. 2 people pull 1 person's scouts ahead, light and fast to mark the best route. We rotate every 10 minutes so nobody burns out. We move as a unit, or we don't move at all. Wyatt stared at her. We don't have time to rig. 5 minutes to rig if we work fast. That still leaves us 40 minutes for 3 kilometers. Tight but possible. And if we fail, Nolan asked, then we fail together, Kira said. But we don't fail because we gave up. Wyatt looked at his watch, looked at the terrain, looked at Kira standing there with absolute conviction in her eyes. No, he said finally. We've wasted too much time already. We leave him. That's my call. You're not in charge, Kira said. Neither are you. Then we vote. This isn't a democracy. No, said a voice from behind them, calm and cold as winter water. It's a test. They all turned. Alexis Brennan stood 20 meters downslope, partially hidden behind scrub brush. And from the dust on her boots, she'd been following them the entire time. Watching. Evaluating. Waiting to see what they'd choose when the pressure was on and the clock was running and the easy answer was right there waiting to be taken. Time, she asked. Wyatt checked his watch. 47 minutes elapsed. Distance covered, 2.2 kilometers. Math, Wyatt's jaw tightened. We can't make it with Thorn. So your solution? Leave him. Send recovery after mission complete. Alexis looked at each of them in turn. Her face was neutral, giving away nothing. Final decision. Final, Wyatt said, and there was something in his voice that wanted her to tell him he was right, wanted validation for making the hard call, wanted someone to confirm that he'd done the tactical thing even though it felt wrong. She didn't give him that validation. You fail, Alexis said. All 4 of you. Reset, 30-minute break, try again. But we would have made it if we left him. Wyatt started and she cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. No excuses. You abandoned a teammate. In my operations, that's not a tactical decision. That's a capital failure. Now move back to start. 30 minutes. Figure it out. They walked back in silence. The break area was the same gravel patch where Rook had circled her yesterday, where he'd mocked her tattoos, where he'd reached for her arm like he had the right. The irony wasn't lost on him. He stood on one leg weight on his good ankle and watched Alexis check equipment 20 meters away. Her back was turned, but he knew she was aware of him, aware of all of them. That particular situational awareness that combat veterans carry like a sixth sense. He limped over. Chief Brennan. She didn't turn, just kept checking carabiner gates, testing each one with her thumb. Chief, I need to say something. Then say it. I'm sorry for what I said yesterday, for touching your ink without permission, for mocking something I didn't understand. I was arrogant and I was wrong and I'm sorry. Now she turned. Her face was neutral. Not angry, not forgiving, just waiting to see if he had anything else. I misjudged you, he continued. I saw the surface and assumed I knew the whole story. I didn't, I don't, and I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment. 3 seconds. 5. Long enough that he started to think she wasn't going to respond at all. Then she spoke, voice quiet and absolutely clear. You think saying sorry fixes it? He blinked. You thought words would erase your disrespect, make everything clean again, put us back to neutral. Words are cheap, Thorn. Anyone can say sorry, costs nothing, requires nothing, just breath and sound. She stepped closer, not threatening, just closing the distance so he couldn't miss a single word. You're young, you're strong, you're fast, you think you've already met the world. Think you understand how things work. Think respect is something you can take back with an apology when you realize you miscalculated. Another step. But here's the truth about this job. It doesn't care how fast you are, doesn't care how charming you are, doesn't care about your clean record or your family legacy or how many pull-ups you can do. Her eyes locked on his. It cares how you respond when you're stripped down to nothing but decision and instinct. When the comfortable answers are all gone. When following orders means abandoning people and breaking orders means risking everything. That's when it matters. That's when I see who you really are. Then what do I do? Rook asked, and his voice cracked slightly. How do I fix this? You learn, Alexis said. Or you don't. But if you plan to walk into rooms like this again, if you plan to lead people in situations where your decisions determine whether they live or die, you better start looking at what people carry. Not what they show, not what's visible on the surface. What they carry that no one else can see. She walked past him without another word, and he stood there with his hands shaking and his throat tight and the crushing weight of understanding that she was right. Words meant nothing. Only action. Only proof. Only the demonstration that he'd actually learned something instead of just performing remorse. Wyatt approached as Alexis walked away. She didn't accept it, Wyatt said. Not a question. No, she wants to see what I do. What we do. Then let's show her. They gathered Team Alpha for the second attempt. Same start line, same equipment, same injured ankle strapped tight to Rook's leg. But different energy, different understanding. Kira leads, Rook said before anyone else could speak. All three of them turned to look at him. What? Wyatt said. I'm senior rank. Rank doesn't matter here, Rook said, voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. She had the solution last time. She saw what we missed. She thought like Chief Brennan when the rest of us thought like recruits protecting our egos. I trust her. Kira stared at him like she was looking for the trick, the angle, the manipulation. Found none. Just saw someone who'd learned something and was trying to apply it even though it cost him pride. I've never led a team before, she said quietly. Neither has anyone in a situation like this, Rook said. But you saw the answer when we were blind. That's leadership. That's what matters. Kira looked at Wyatt and Nolan. Both nodded, not enthusiastically, not happily, but they nodded because they could see it too. Could see that she'd been right and they'd been wrong, and pretending otherwise would just mean failing again. Okay, Kira said, voice gaining strength. Here's the plan. Nolan, you scout ahead light and fast. Mark safe paths with chem lights. Call back hazards. You're our eyes. Nolan nodded, already stripping unnecessary weight from his vest. Wyatt and I build a drag rig for Rook. We rotate every 10 minutes. Nobody carries alone. Rook, you conserve energy. Hop when you can. Let us pull when you can't. We move as one unit or we don't move. She looked at each of them. Questions? No questions, Wyatt said. Then let's move. They built the rig in 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Rope harness around Rook's torso. Carabiners clipped to anchor points on Wyatt and Kira's vests. Nolan already 50 meters ahead, marking the first clear path. Go, Graves said, and the timer started. This time they moved like a unit. Nolan sprinting ahead, placing chem lights at decision points, calling back intel about terrain. Wyatt and Kira pulling in synchronized rhythm, heel over heel, letting the rope and leverage do the work instead of just muscle. And Rook suspended in the harness, contributing what he could, hopping, when the terrain allowed, letting himself be pulled, when it didn't, trusting that his team had him. 20 minutes in, Kira called the first rotation. Rook, you hop for 400 meters. Give us a break. You sure? He asked. We planned rotations. We stick to the plan. He unclipped from the drag rig and moved on his own painful, hobbling progress. But Wyatt and Kira flanked him on either side, close enough to support without carrying, letting him maintain dignity while providing safety net. 45 minutes in, they hit the creek crossing, the same obstacle that had taken Rook down the first time. Nolan, Kira called forward. Scout a forward point. Shallow water, good footing. On it. 30 seconds later, his voice came back. 50 meters upstream, ankle-deep rock bottom, slower current. They diverted, crossed together. Wyatt and Kira positioned on either side of Rook, making sure his good foot found solid purchase on every step. Slower than the direct route, but safer. No one fell. No one floundered. 70 minutes elapsed. 3.8 kilometers covered. They could see the extraction point flag now maybe 800 meters away on a hill that looked taller than it had from the start line. Everyone was exhausted, breathing hard, legs burning, but synchronized, moving together with the kind of unity that only comes from shared purpose. Final push, Kira said. Back in the rig, Rook. We pull together, Nolan clear us a straight line. Ignore fancy routes. Just fastest path that won't break an ankle. Copy. The last 800 meters took 17 minutes. Wyatt and Kira pulling with everything they had left, Nolan ranging ahead and coming back to help. When the grade got steep and Rook trying to contribute, even though his ankle was screaming and his entire body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. They crossed the extraction line at 88 minutes and 34 seconds. Collapsed in a heap, gasping, laughing, some of them crying with relief and exhaustion in the particular joy that comes from succeeding at something you weren't sure you could do. Alleguis walked up the hill toward them. Her face was still neutral, still giving away nothing. She stood over them while they caught their breath and didn't speak until Kira managed to sit up and look at her. Time, Alexis asked. 88:34. Kira gasped. Long pause. You pass. The relief was physical. You could see it roll through all four of them like a wave. They stood slowly wobbly, and Alexis looked at each of them in turn. What changed, she asked, between attempt 1 and attempt 2? Wyatt spoke first. We listened. To everyone. Why? Rook stepped forward, favoring his good ankle voice rough but clear. Because rank doesn't mean wisdom. Strength doesn't mean leadership. And ego doesn't save lives. The person with the best idea isn't always the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it's the quietest. And if you're not listening to everyone, you're not leading. You're just making noise. Alexis nodded slowly, then turned to Kira. You led. Why did they let you? Because they learned to trust capability over hierarchy. Because they valued the mission over their pride. Good answer. She turned back to Rook, stepped closer. Close enough that he could see the faded lines of tattoos on her forearms, the marks that told stories he was just beginning to understand. You gave up leadership, she said. Why? Because someone else was better suited. Because my ego matters less than the team's success. Because you taught me that carrying weight doesn't make you weak. It makes you worthy. Something flickered in Alexis's eyes, not emotion exactly, more like recognition. The acknowledgement that a lesson had landed and taken root. She extended her hand. You learned Thorn. He shook it. Firm grip, equal respect. Don't forget it, because next time it won't be a drill. Next time someone's mother will be waiting to find out if her son comes home. And your decisions will determine the answer to that question. I won't forget, Chief. I swear it. She held his hand for another moment, then released and stepped back. Good. Now get cleaned up. Debriefing at 1600. Dismissed. They limped off the course together, Team Alpha 4 people who'd been strangers and were now something else. Not friends exactly, but bound by shared failure and shared success, and the understanding that they'd been tested and measured and had proven something worth proving. And on the hill behind them, Alexis Brennan stood alone and watched them go, and on her face was the smallest suggestion of a smile. 1 week later, the barracks were almost empty. Most recruits had shipped out to their next assignments. Rook was packing his gear, carefully rolling uniforms and checking equipment with the methodical precision he'd learned from watching someone who did everything with purpose. A knock on the door frame made him turn. Alexis stood there in civilian clothes, jeans, plain black shirt, the tattoos visible on both arms in the afternoon light. Chief, he said, standing automatically. Thorn. She stepped into the room and handed him a folded piece of paper, thick stock, the kind you use for something important. For you. He unfolded it carefully. A hand-drawn map, crude lines in black ink, just like the tattoo on her arm. Paths and waypoints and symbols he didn't fully understand but could read the intention behind. In the margins, notes in neat handwriting. Fallback routes, trust your team, lead with humility, carry your failures forward, not like weight but like wisdom. At the bottom, signed simply AB. His voice cracked. Chief, I don't deserve this. You're right, you don't, not yet. She stepped closer. But you will if you remember, if you apply it, if you take what you learned here and let it change how you lead when it matters. I will, I promise. Good. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Thorn Chief, Red McKenna, the man I carried in Kurdistan. You asked about him during the exercise, but I didn't answer fully. He teaches shop class now, high school in Virginia Beach. Every Veterans Day, he tells his students the story, says I saved his life. She looked back at him, and her eyes were clear and steady. But the truth is, he saved mine. He taught me that carrying weight doesn't make you weak. It makes you worthy. Remember that. I will. She walked away, and Rook stood there, holding the map and feeling the weight of something precious and rare. A lesson given freely by someone who'd earned the right to teach it through blood and pain and survival. He looked down at his forearm. Clean skin, no tattoos, no marks. But he pulled out a pen from his pack and wrote on his wrist, careful block letters, "Respect equals what you carry that no one else can see." Not permanent ink, not yet, but it was a start. He walked out of the barracks into California sun, same boots as before, but the man inside them was different, changed. Reformed by understanding that capability and respect and leadership weren't about being loud or strong or right. They were about listening when others spoke, learning when you failed, carrying weight without complaint, remembering the cost of decisions, and honoring the people who taught you those lessons by becoming someone worthy of having been taught. In the parking lot, Alexa stood beside her truck and watched him walk away, saw his new posture, the humility in his stride, the awareness in how he moved through space, now more careful, more conscious of what he carried and what others carried around him. She nodded to herself. One more student graduated, one more lesson delivered. Then she climbed in her truck and drove away, and on her arms the tattoos caught afternoon sun. 23 marks telling 23 stories that most people would never hear and didn't need to hear because the lessons they taught were being passed forward to people who would carry them into places where those lessons would save lives. The girl with too many tattoos. They'd circled her, mocked her, touched what they didn't understand. And by the time they learned what those marks really meant, what each one represented in blood and sacrifice and memory, it was too late to take back their words. But it wasn't too late to learn. And in the learning, maybe some of them became worthy of the lesson. Respect isn't earned by how loud you are. It's earned by what you carry that no one else can see.